Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. We'll talk with experts on a wide range of topics, including nutrition, stress relief, sleep, mental health, etc.
And we'll dig into the issues that can cause fertility challenges, like PCOS, or early menopause, or cancer treatment.
So if you're curious about your fertility, whether you're ready to start a family,
or you're preserving your options for the future, let's dig in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
I'm Ann Judge.
And today we're kind of going in a different direction than our last main episode. So it's a little bit different. We had so much fun with Will Bulsiewicz last time. It was such a great talk. And we have another good one for you today, too. Ann, what's up? Anything
Well, I was thinking
new?
It's actually kind of a good pivot because we were talking all about the gut health and how your gut is a brain. And now we're moving to more of what we think of as the actual brain, right? We're going to talk more about someone in our practice who is very familiar with all things psychological. We're super happy to have her here with us today.
Yeah, she is an expert on a lot of things that we're going to be talking about today. And I'm really excited for this conversation because it's an area that I'm not super knowledgeable in all the details. So it's a fun area to talk about. All right, so I'm going to introduce our guest. Her name is Melanie Mickelson. She has over 20 years working in the field of fertility counseling with a special interest in third-party reproduction, which includes like donor sperm and eggs, donor embryo programs, and donor screening. She is the vice chair of the mental health professional group at the American Society for Reproductive Medicine and has served on several mental health ASRM groups, including Telemental Health Task Force, Coding Task Force, Gamut and Embryo Donation Mental Health Guideline Committee, Gestational Surrogate Mental Health Guidelines Committee, and past chair of the ASRM Mental Health Mentoring Committee.
That's a mouthful.
Right?
Mental health mentoring. I like that.
Mental Health Mentoring Committee. She is currently the director of professional training for Empower Donation and member of the Society for Ethics for Egg Donation and Surrogacy, which is acronymed SEEDS, which I love. She has given numerous presentations and appeared on podcasts surrounding gamete donation, anonymity, and embryo donation. Melanie is a mental health counselor within Seattle Reproductive Medicine, so she's one of our peeps, and creator of Hold Help, LLC, a fertility counseling and advocacy practice. In her spare time, she loves doing anything involving lakes or mountains, laughing with her family, and chasing her puppy, Poppy, which I absolutely love that name for a puppy. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you, ladies. It's great to be here with you and love sharing information and having a chat today.
Well, often we start off by asking our guests just kind of how they came to this field. So what kind of first got you interested in counseling, but then especially how did you end up in reproductive medicine?
Well, great question. Like many of us that work in this field of fertility counseling, I actually got to the field of fertility counseling through my own personal journey. Mm-hmm. And I like to say I'm a 3-time IVF survivor. I'm very lucky that led to twins. I have 26-year-old non-identical twin daughters, extra support for the times that we were going through it because it can be very isolating. Family members and friends often really don't understand what you're going through. So for me, I say that it is a field definitely in a profession that picked me. I didn't necessarily pick it, but it was wonderful to be able to switch into working in this field. Prior to that, I did work more in just general counseling with employee assistance programs. I did a lot of working with children. I worked with families of divorce, kind of all across the gamut of what you would work with as an initial therapist.
I like that you worked across the gamut and now you get to work with gametes. So you're covering everything.
Yes, indeed.
Oh my goodness. Well-rounded in the gamut.
I'm a little punchy, and so is Melanie too. We were both at ASRM, which is the big national fertility conference. And so we were there until yesterday flying back. And so I really appreciate you spending this time with us. And it was funny for me going to these different mixer events, how often you quickly pass the small talk and just start talking about what everyone's past fertility treatment was. Because it is so common for people that work in this field to have come to it from a place of personal experience.
For sure. And I agree. Coming off the conference, I'm a little rummy myself. However, I think all of this is fresh in our minds too.
Well, your talk was fascinating. So I'm super excited to rehash it again today so our listeners can hear it.
And I was not at the conference, so you think I'd be well rested, but apparently I didn't sleep very well last night. So I'm right there with you.
Well, let's start kind of from the beginning. When people are coming to see you and they're thinking about any kind of what we call third-party reproduction. So as Ruby said, donor eggs, donor sperm, or donor embryos, what are some of the most common questions that people ask you?
Well, there are a lot of different questions that we get asked. To back up, one thing that I always like to keep in mind is really when I work with people, there are three stories that are being told here. One is the story of the potential parents or parent and the process of conception and really getting to the point in their mind where they're ready to think about using a donor egg or a donor sperm or potentially losing their genetic connection. So that's one story that's being told. The second story that's being told is the story about hopefully a future child or children. Talking about that child's story, their conception, their genetic heritage, and helping provide education to parents that are going to use this different method of family formation using some type of a gamete donation. And then the third story that I think sometimes people forget that we are very involved with and have to work with is our donors. I've screened egg donors for, 24 years. I do some screening of sperm donors, but that would only be in known sperm donor cases. But in this particular third part, my responsibility is to really work with donors to educate them, help them understand the decision making that is going to affect them if they decide to become a donor, not only now, but in their future as well. As potentially, how might this affect their own families that might not even know they're donating an egg? How will it affect them in their future going forward if they themselves decide to have children? So really, it's important to look at all three pieces, the intended parents, the potential children, as well as the donors that we serve.
Totally. I feel like there's this perception that, like, especially in the media, that like people are just out there trying to rope in donors. It's all just about it. I think people don't realize, first of all, how hard it is to become a donor. I mean, you have to pass a lot of screening tests physically as well as genetically. And so, we really want to take care of our donors. And you're right. It's one of those things that we're trying to make sure everybody involved in this process understands the potential repercussions.
I just had a talk with one of the leads at California Cryo, one of the sperm banks, and I think he was saying that like it's 1% of donors or something that actually gets approved from application to actually submitting samples. So that's in the sperm donor side. And then egg donor, there's even more, I feel like more that goes into that in terms of the procedures and everything. There's a very rigorous screening process. So even if you make it through to be accepted as a donor, that's hard enough. And then you have to be able to be okay with all of these things that you're talking about.
Correct. And I also educate our donors. I say, hey, being a donor is not for everybody, and that's okay. And in response to your statistics, I also tell people that really any good reputable clinic or egg donor bank should be 1% to 2% only of all of the applicants we receive actually get accepted and make it through the full donor screen.
Yeah, you want them to be selective.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I explain to donors on the flip side that, hey, you might be the greatest person in the world. I think you are. But it's nothing personal, that at any stage there is something medically, psychologically, legally, physically that could rule you out.
Yeah, I used to, now I'm just far too old to be a donor. But back when I was of, quote, age, there were several things I'm like, well, couldn't be a donor for this reason, for this reason, and for this reason.
Right.
I'm sure I have lovely eggs, but...
When you have people who are coming to see you and they're just sort of starting that process of considering using some form of donor gametes, what are kind of some of the common questions?
One of the things that people, first of all, should know about when they come to talk to us as the mental health professionals We are not there to be the gatekeepers, and we're not there to judge them. And we are not definitely trying to assess whether or not they should be fit to be parents or not. So that's one really important misconception.
When I hear from people too, that's one of the most commonly described anxieties, especially among same-sex couples or LGBTQIA couples. They're very, very concerned about that. And part of that is the legal stuff that surrounds that. It's just reassuring to know that when you're going into a counseling visit, it can be intimidating, but you're there for them. You're there to support them through this journey.
Exactly. And one of the things that can help us and help the patients is if their physicians or their nurse practitioners or any of the donor team do as well as our staff does with helping to front load that, so that that's where the expectation setting starts. And then I generally will begin every session again, making sure that people are clear and understand what my role is and what my role is not. The other thing I like to talk to patients about is, really, I want them to feel like they can use me as an advocate. And what I say is, feel free to use me, because it's really hard to know all the steps in this process. So I see part of my role is I either know the answer to a question they might have, or I at least know where to tell them to go seek the answer. And so I really encourage patients to, use me in that respect as well. When they first come to us, most of the times I'm seeing patients that are already in a spot where they've made a decision.
That was going to be my next question. Are people seeing you like they're all ready, or do you get some people where they're just trying to decide if they're even open to it?
I would say there's both of those cases. In that respect, what I typically would do then is have a counseling session or two with them first, see what their concerns are, and then do a session for either a donor egg recipient or a donor embryo or donor sperm recipient. And quite honestly, there are times when people themselves don't know they enter the session, and it quickly becomes apparent to me that either they're not on the same page as their partner, or if the tears immediately start to flow, which tears can be very fine and very normal. This is an emotional grieving process. It is a loss to say goodbye to our genetic connection. But if it feels more like, this is really something new to them and it hasn't been processed, and or they're maybe on different sides of that equation with their partner, that's a good time to say, it is okay to pause. And then that kind of my role becomes more education, as well as sometimes couples therapy, as well as talking about, what has been the past grief and loss and trauma. What's their fertility treatment been like up until that point? Has that gone fairly well, even though they're not pregnant? Or has it been very stressful and very discouraging to them?
Yeah, because that doesn't go away, right? It's like layer upon layer. Yeah.
I call it the exponential grief.
Yeah.
And I also joke, but true, it's a club none of us want to be in. Let's face it, right? So none of us thought we're going to sign up to be in this infertility club. But once you're in it, it's actually a very supportive club if you know where to get the right resources. And I would say that for traditional fertility treatments as well as any kind of third-party treatments. In regards to what if people are on different pages, right? Like, let's say the partners. My bias is the no has to win out, because we can't really think about how that would be healthy to bring a child into the world where one person really wasn't up for this and really didn't want to bring that child into the world. So my kind of sticking point with that is, kind of until we can at least get on the same page, the person who's saying no to this type of treatment really wins out at that point.
Mm-hmm. And especially when you're potentially open to something like donor egg, that mention of a pause is so important, because I think that's one of the issues is people, if they have been doing treatment with their own eggs, often have been feeling just that pressure that every month is so important, and they feel like they can't take the time to process and to get on the same page. But once you open up that window to using the eggs from someone in their 20s, you suddenly have lots of time to pause. And so you're right, you don't want to move forward before you're ready, or if you have a partner who's not ready before they're ready, because you don't have that same clock anymore if we're now taking that expected decline that goes along with age in the egg quality out of our equation.
Yeah, generally there's time to take a breather in most cases, as long as your age isn't approaching that clinic cutoff for doing treatment. But of course, if you're going along the process and it's something that's been offered by your provider, you're probably probably aware of that. So yeah, it's nice to know that there is some breathing room here. You don't have to just jump into donor egg. It's not a decision that you have to make today. Might be okay with it today, and maybe tomorrow you're like, oh, I don't know. So it's actually important to give yourself time to think about all the options.
And every clinic is going to have different policies, but in general, we're talking about people using their own eggs. Things get really hard once you're past the early 40s, but once we go to donor egg, most clinics, that cutoff is now early or mid 50s, usually by 51, because that's sort of the average age of menopause. Some clinics might shift a little, but suddenly you're talking about, in most cases, years difference in terms of what is your option to move forward. So I think it's so important to take that mental break, so you don't feel like you've done nothing but the roller coaster of treatment from one form to the other.
Totally.
I love that you both brought that up, because that was something that I was going to say too, that sometimes, and again, not to minimize what they're going through, but sometimes I do reframe and make in the positive exactly what you're saying, that, hey, the pressure is off right now. And you do sort of see the light in their eyes come up a little bit more. And when I talk about that and I say, for some women, this is a time to have some renewed hope, some renewed cautious optimism, because we're taking your egg age out of there. You have time. You can take a couple of months if you need to off to make these decisions. You're not going to go through the same grind of the fertility meds. You literally see the relief in their eyes and in their body. That's where, again, we have to sort of reframe and find out, well, what are the positives beyond just, hey, if your goal is a healthy take-home baby, your odds and statistics have really changed right now. And you're going to be maybe facing situations where you actually, wow, you have more than one embryo, or wow, you might even have enough embryos to freeze. So that approach really, I think, can help people get excited about this more than only seeing how hard it is. But I still, again, never minimize the grief, the loss of that genetic connection, and opening the door. They got to close that door a little bit just to even crack open our next donor door, I say, and stick your little toe in the pond and see if it even feels good to you. And one of the questions I think you guys, probably have asked or wondered about is, being on different pages. But what I've sometimes seen, this isn't as common, but sometimes I do see couples that feel like if it can't be my egg or if it can't be my sperm, then I don't want it to be either. We would rather do donor, in other words, donor egg and donor sperm, because they feel like somehow that really levels, I say, the genetic playing field.
There's not like that appearance of tipped scales.
Exactly. And I'm not saying pro or con one way or the other. I'm just saying that that is a choice that people sometimes make, not as commonly, as long as they understand too. I think sometimes they don't realize, though, the expense of that,
right,
and that it's going to add more expense and usually more time to your screening. But once again, if that's super important to you, then that is something that they definitely have an option to do.
And that brings up what I think we're going to save for our snack, which is, if you're not going to have genetics from either one, do you want to look at using donor embryos that have already been created? So we'll kind of hold off on that conversation for our snack. But you're right. I've also seen people in that scenario you mentioned, where they want to not just select donor embryos that someone else had left over, but specifically pick their own egg donor, pick their own sperm donor, so that they're in the control of all that. But that is suddenly a very expensive cycle. like you said, I've had a few patients where that's something that they feel called to do. But for most people, if they're able to use gametes from one or the two, if they are in a partner, that's often making at least one part of the process a little bit simpler.
Yes.
When you're picking one donor, that's hard enough, and now you have to choose between two and try to do all the things that are important to you for each donor. But another thing that I learned from the head of the cryobank that I just gave a talk with is even, no matter what choice you make, it's a good choice because they have been rigorously screened. This is the 1%. So they're all good choices, and it can be stressful to try to pick a donor. But if you kind of think about it that way, like all these donors are good donors, it can take a little of the pressure off.
Yes. And I joke, but I'm serious. Sometimes it's funny because, especially in, with the husband and a wife couple, the husband will sometimes forget if we're looking at donor eggs. And I say, now don't forget, for better or worse, we get your 50% of your genetics in there, right? And it's almost like they kind of get caught up in picking the egg donor or get excited about those choices and yet forget, oh, right, I've still got my sperm in here.
So if you pick a donor who's like super tall, but you're really short, that doesn't mean you're going to end up with a tall child.
Exactly.
You can't blame it on the donor later on.
Exactly. Yes. And I also tell patients all the time, hey, the framework is there is no perfect donor, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
We can't clone you, at least not yet. But if you're having to go through these extra steps, you might as well get what you want. Why not get what you want in a donor? But again, like we talked about, every donor is going to have great qualities and great characteristics. They're not all going to be in one donor necessarily. So my suggestion is, you narrow down to your top 2 or 3 choices, run through your list again, and then out of those, you'll be able to pick the best.
This isn't like The Sims. We can't just pick all
build
the different
your donor.
build your donor.
Right.
And I think one of the things that is so different now is, at least in our clinic, majority of people tend to be using lots of frozen eggs. So picking a donor is more similar to what it used to be like picking a sperm donor, which means sometimes you do have the opportunity to pick again. If you pick one and you end up not having an embryo to transfer or you don't get pregnant, it's not like in the old days where maybe you had excess embryos because you had a donor and that donor had 20 eggs and you kind of feel like you have to work through those embryos, versus now you start with a smaller lot. But that also means that if it doesn't work, it's good, I think, to be a bit open to that idea that maybe you want to try the same donor and maybe you want to try something different. So just like when we had people picking sperm donors, I often say the same thing. I say it's good to buy several vials, but don't buy out everything because you may not want to always keep this donor. Even if you think from the profile, this is the fit for me, if you end up not getting pregnant, suddenly you're going to want to explode into other options.
Definitely. And I want to just jump back to one thing in regards to grief and loss of a genetic connection and how that is so different, though, with different populations that we work with. So in other words, if you are a same-sex male couple, you've always known you're going to need an egg donor and a gestational carrier. So the loss is different. It's not less necessarily because it's still a lot of hoops to jump through and a lot to go through just to create your family, but it's different than the mourning of the loss of your genetic connection. And I would say the same thing for lesbian couples. It's the same thing. They've always known they're going to need a sperm donor. However, as we know, sometimes though we still have lesbian couples that might need an egg donor. Or if there's a same-sex lesbian couple that they want to do what we call more of a shared maternity cycle, they will still need a donor sperm, but perhaps they'll use partner one's egg and then partner two will carry. For many people, it's a very important part of their journey to try and combine all those pieces and parts to make it feel like they've had the most participation as possible.
And that's why I really appreciate what you first said about how you're approaching that conversation from different ways, because I do feel like, as we said in the beginning, sometimes people who've always known they would have to use a donor egg or donor sperm feel like, well, I don't need to meet with a counselor. But it's still good to have that conversation of thinking about for this future child. That's what I really see as being the benefit from counseling for everybody. And because you might not have always thought about the questions that might come up from a child, where maybe they're going to want to know something about the donor that you hadn't considered. And especially this pivots into our next point, how much the field has changed in terms of this idea of anonymity. So having done this a long time, I'm really curious to know, how have you changed your speech versus when you used to talk about having an anonymous donor, and what do you say now?
Wow, big changes in the way that I speak about things. And I'm sure for Anne, you and Ruby too, I'm sure just you've been at this a long time, and our changes are fast and furious often. But one of the biggest pieces that I help educate donors and intended parents on is, gone are the days of anonymity. And we did used to use that word, and I used to use that word, and we would say, oh, this is an anonymous program, or you can be an anonymous egg donor. All of that changed with the advent of DNA testing, Ancestry.com, 23andMe. Anybody can find anybody. We're catching serial killers with DNA, not that your donor is a serial killer. But it is nowadays, and most people know this already, and they know that even if you don't test, even if your donor doesn't test, it's your grandma Sue that tests, and somewhere someone will find out that you are genetically related. They've done studies now, because they also have organizations that can help people that are trying to find either, people that were adopted trying to find genetic family, or even people that have used donors and the now adult children. There was some study that I think like 48 hours, someone could help you put all those pieces together. Even if a donor hadn't tested, you could still put the pieces together to find out who your donor was. Okay. So what I say, and the wording I use, is we protect your privacy, but we cannot guarantee anonymity. And along the lines of privacy, I say, just like we protect your non-identifying information. I mean, when that's shown in a profile, it's not as though your name is out there for the donor, but it is something that non-identifying information and privacy protection. That's different than saying anonymous. I also tell donors that because of this, if they are not comfortable with the fact that someone could still come knocking on their cyber door 18 years from now or plus, they really shouldn't be being a donor. And so there are some sperm banks, well, actually quite a few sperm banks now, that they won't take a donor unless they agree to be what we call open ID or identity release, and I'll explain that in a minute. So in other words, they won't let a donor be a donor unless they agree to that future openness to the child.
And that's been the policy for a long time in like other countries, right? Isn't that one of the
Correct.
issues with the US, is that we were having sperm donors? Was it the UK? I think a lot of countries for a while now have had this policy that you can only be a donor if you're open to this.
Yeah, and I think there is a caveat, like you can be like, you have to agree that the child can contact you at 18 years versus knowing the identity from the get-go.
Exactly. I think egg donors, egg donation, egg banks, in-house egg programs, I think we lag behind a little bit in not the counseling of the donors of that, but that it's more of an expectation that the majority of the donors are going to be able to be open identity release when that child, not their parent, as you said, Ruby, when that cute little toddler grows up to be that little cute 18-year-old and wants to know more information about the donor, then that's where most of the sperm banks are further ahead of us. And we counsel all of our egg donors because we have a slightly different law in Washington state. California passed after we did a very similar law stating that basically, again, any donor conceived person that is 18 or above, not the parent, that donor conceived child person now is entitled to know the donor's real name, date of birth, and their last known address. However, what's so confusing to people, and myself included, is the donor can still sign what we call a declaration that says, hey, I don't want you to release my identifying information. And the donor has the choice to say yes or no. So we actually have them sign this consent form on what they would like, versus some sperm banks are saying, you don't really have that option. The option is, if you want to be a sperm donor with us, you need to come in knowing it is already built in. It's the default that we will release that information to a child at age 18 or above.
But you don't necessarily have to engage with that child. Like if the child reaches out, gets your information, you don't have to engage. Or if you don't want to have a relationship, you don't have to engage, is what I understand anyway.
Correct. So what I say is, hey, we're not planning a meet and greet. Nobody's promising a party or a get together, right? But you are correct. The responsibility for egg banks, sperm banks, and clinics is that we have to release that identifying information, okay? What sometimes I see, though, is the flip side. So with intended parents, this isn't a reciprocal law. It has nothing to do with them. And so I have to make sure that they understand it doesn't mean the donor is going to have access to your identifying information. It's not reciprocal. It has nothing to do with that.
That's such a good point.
Right. People don't understand that, because when I can see in their face when I start to talk about it with the intended parents, they get real nervous, And then I have to say, you know what? The donor is not trying to stalk you. They don't want to stalk you. And then I have to tell the donors, I promise the intended parents aren't trying to stalk you, because they're like, oh boy, I don't, But anecdotally, what I would say also is the majority of donors that we screen, at least, and there are regional differences, I can tell you, across the country. The majority of donors we screen, I'd say 70 to 80% probably at this point are saying yes. So in other words, they're saying, yes, I agree, I approve. But I also counsel donors, even if you sign no on that, same thing, hey, no guarantee, nothing. This is a piece of paper you've signed, but then that's when I still go back and talk about, direct to consumer genetic testing.
How you're explaining this is just showing the importance and how helpful a counselor is, because you can break down the differences of all these things, because it's very complicated and it varies. So it's very important to have somebody that knows the ins and outs of this kind of stuff.
Well, thank you. I like to think I do. And the other way I always feel like, especially when you're embedded in a clinic, is that we're so helpful, because you know what? The other medical providers, the donor team, the doctors, they don't have time. And that's okay, because we all need to work collaboratively. And as I said in the beginning of this, I'm an advocate. That's my part of being an advocate too, to help work with donors, to help work with intended parents, and then to be the caveat of the link between, if needed, because that is a lot of the work I do too, is I'll listen to the frustration they might have about their treatment so far, or something that I can really help direct them, like, have you talked to this person, or have you thought about mentioning that? So I would like to say, I know we don't have any data on this, but across the board, when I talk to other therapists, 95 almost % of people end up saying, this was really helpful. Even the people that come in kicking and screaming and saying, why do I have to do this? This is ridiculous. Their arms are crossed. They're not happy to see me. In the end, it's like a different person, and they're so thankful. And I feel so thankful that we had that time together, that, there's things, it's the cliche, you don't know what you don't know. So I always feel like, you can tell that even though they didn't want to be here, in the end, they're so glad.
When I was at the conference, one of the people I was talking with is a provider up at a clinic in Canada, and she was saying the same thing, except in their clinic, every person who's going to do any sort of ART cycle, so any sort of IVF, even if it's their own eggs, own sperm, every single person has to meet with their counselor before they start a cycle.
I kind of like that. You just have your established person, like no matter what you're doing. And then there's not like, because what you brought up at the beginning, there's this idea when you're going to see a counselor, like we're going to be quizzing you or judging you or telling you how to parent or something like that. That's a very common misconception. If like just across the board, like everyone says like, hey, this is stressful. There's a lot of stuff that you don't know about going in. I'm your advocate. I'm your person. The plan is this is what you talked about with your doctor. How are you feeling? All those things.
And she said the same thing, that in the years she's worked there, she can maybe think of like two people that at the end were like, that was a waste of time. Everybody else, even if they didn't want to do it, found it helpful. So I agree. I wish we could make it even more incorporated than it is in our clinic.
So we need to clone you.
Yeah.
Well, and the resources we offer, because again, anybody can Google their resources and find all these fertility support things, but they might not know about, the closed fertility support group that we have, or they might not know that they get so overwhelmed with the breadth of resources that it's like, this is the one that is most of the patients love, or, you can provide feedback. I hold up little books. I even show my books of like, this is my favorite one of the donor conceived books that I would refer to.
Even though the research on what questions might come up from donor-conceived children is a little bit more new, and that's why there is this new push for open identity access, a lot of that comes from the research that we've had about adoption and how adoption processes changed so much over the years, where we wouldn't even tell children they were adopted because, that's going to be stressful. Just it's better if we never talk about it. And now we've realized how much better it is for it to be part of that child's story from their whole beginning. Do you know, when we think about research from adoption, what percentage of children kind of want to seek out information from an adoptive family? Because I'm curious, now that we have more of a generation of kids that have grown up in more of these open contacts, I don't know if anyone studied what percentage of people are actually seeking additional information in that scenario, and if we can apply that at all to here.
I think, there's a lot of things that we can apply. And I say to people, you know what, this isn't adoption, but the good news is we've learned a lot of good stuff from that adoption model. And the things that we have learned are that tell early, tell often. Secrets imply shame. Do you want to keep a lifelong secret? And then we talk about how we definitely know that people that are told later in life, even later being adolescence, when you're in the throes of hormones and developmental changes, do worse than people that are told earlier on, almost preconceptual, where you want it to be something that when someone asks your child shrugs their shoulders and sort of says, I don't know, I don't remember a drop the bombshell moment of my parent telling me, I've just always known.
Yeah, it's an identity thing. The identity that you grew up with. And if you had this identity growing up and now you're a teenager, like you said, with all these hormones, all of a sudden things have shaken up and everything you've known about yourself is different. I can imagine how stressful that is. So if you just knew all along, like, I was adopted.
I have brown eyes and I had a donor egg.
And I had a donor egg.
Right. And we have all kinds of age-appropriate books and ways that we can talk to children. And I encourage our patients, I know you're not going to remember all this. And I know you're going to say, I'm going to tell. And then years go by, maybe more than you want, and you call back and it's quite all right. And you say, I've had a lot of patients and they're like, oh my God, I haven't done it yet. I know I should have done it. And I'm like, okay, deep breath. It's never too late. We'll start. Let's talk about how we're going to make that happen. I don't know, is their child going to want information when they're 18, 25? Not until they go to have a child themselves. Every child's going to be different in that, right? I don't say probably never or maybe never, because I don't think that's true. In this age of DNA testing, everybody wants to know our genetic history, right? We all want to know our ancestry to some degree. It's natural to have genetic curiosity. And so I really just try and normalize that. That is a very normal process that people want to know that. Think about it if you or I have a grandparent that died and we never knew them, but yet we get to see their picture. When people grow up and want information, the most important thing to remember is they're not looking for a parent. They don't see the donor as their parent. They see their donor as their donor. And whatever contact or relationship that they may or may not have with them ongoing, that's between two adults at that point. No one else has parented that child for 18 plus years. You're the only parent they have. And it's normal curiosity. What do we know? We need research. We need more research. We have some good. And what are they looking for? Donor-conceived people are typically looking for, again, a picture's worth 1,000 words. They want to see a picture. They want to know updated health history on the donor, if they haven't already gotten that. And they want to know, does the donor themselves have any other children? And they often do, right? Beyond that, whether or not they have connection or if they find out more, who knows? What I always find really fascinating, sometimes even more than once they meet the donor or, maybe they've met the donor, they want to know, do they have genetic half-siblings? And they will, especially in donor sperm scenarios, they will definitely have genetic half-siblings. And if you think about it, I can talk about donor stuff all day long. I am not donor conceived. I don't know exactly what that feels like. So to be connected with other people, donor conceived, same donor, it really grows their world, right? It's like this whole new connection. And sibling groups can be small or on a very large size, and not every person wants to be heavily involved. So that's the other thing. Sometimes now that we're learning more and we're hearing more, which is a really great thing from donor conceived people, some people are like, great, cool, I know you're out there, right? Okay, we're all in a Facebook group together. Yippee. I don't really need to see you or know any more about you. Whereas others are like, we meet every 2 years. We have a reunion. I feel like I've met my long lost sibling. I would say that's especially true in cases where patients only have one child. They often feel like, wow, I have this great new family connection. So my bottom line message is it's not something to be feared. It's normal genetic curiosity. And as a parent, you're going to have a lot of years before that parenting your child to help prep. It starts from the top down, as we know. The best gift you can give your child is helping them understand that if they come to mom and dad and want to know about the donor or the profile or have questions, that mom and dad aren't going to freak out about it, that basically they're going to be like, hey, we're here to help you. Or it's fine to say, I don't know the answer about your donor. I don't know that. But hey, when you're older, if you want help finding out that information, we're here to help you.
We had an episode with Jamie Kelton from If These Ovaries Could Talk, the Queer Families podcast, and she talked about planting seeds, like little seeds along the way. So developmentally appropriate. And so it's always there. They're always talking about it, and it just kind of grows as they get older.
Yeah, that phrase of genetic curiosity, I think that's a really good phrasing it's a normal curiosity about your genetics.
Yeah.
But it is good what you mentioned in the beginning too, to understand what information is provided, because you don't want children to think, especially if you talk about it from an early age, that there's going to be this magical, and when I turn 18, I meet my donor, because you're going to get this basic amount of information, and then whatever happens beyond that is going to be very individualized.
And the reality is, the donor might not want to meet you. Mm-hmm. You would still have the identifying information, which, you could find them so easily, right? And especially if they're genetic testing. But that's the reality. Your donor might not want to meet you, or your donor might have died. I had a donor that I screened years ago that is deceased now. So there are those issues to consider too.
Which is another reason that you kind of feel like the counseling piece is not just something before you do this, like especially if you have a teenager that's starting to get closer to that window, like, gosh, they should really have a meeting with a counselor first to be aware of the various possibilities before they do just blindly reach out.
Agree. And the flip side to that, I've been very lucky to sometimes be able to work with donors too. And I had a very interesting case, and I don't even know how he got to me. I think in part because nobody else would really talk to him. And he was an older male, had been a sperm donor, and was suddenly, this was a couple of years ago, was suddenly being contacted. Like, there is no guidance. There's no one to help me, to tell me, how do I deal with this? Well, you need to let the rest of your family members know, step one. And he was interested in meeting the offspring. So it wasn't, but I don't think he had realized, and I think a lot of people don't realize that this could be 10 kids, 5 kids, 35, 50 kids. And you have to pace yourself. And we kind of talked about, and I suggested him almost coming up with like an info sheet, all the information that people typically want to know, and that would be something tangible he could provide, especially if it was starting to feel overwhelming with too many people reaching out.
What we should also consider too is a lot of donors, not all of them in terms of sperm donors, but definitely for egg donors, is they're in their younger life, right? They're usually in their 20s or very early 30s. And so what they think about now and how they perceive their lives going is going to be completely different. And now they're having children come, 18 years later. You thought it was going to be fine. You thought you were going to be fine with it when you first did a sperm donation, or even now we're coming across people that didn't have that same DNA level of access. So I'm sure it's very difficult when you reach 18 years later and now you approach it differently. Maybe you have kids of your own. You're like, wow, now how do I deal with all these things? I never thought about having to deal with these things.
Exactly. And that's where I feel like I'd love to become more involved with that. And I am in different ways right now, but I hope to be more so with donor conceived adults and working with donor conceived children as well, honestly, as the donors, because you're right. We all, when we started this, and I started 24 years ago, I didn't know it was going to look like this. I thought I was saying the right thing by saying it's anonymous, Who knew that this was going to happen? And so things have changed so rapidly, especially recently, that we did the best we could at that time, but our model has changed now. And I feel like we owe it to donors as well if they have questions or if there's things that I might be able to help them with. Now, I can't necessarily, if a donor calls back and says, hey, could you tell me the name of the people I donated to? Or, obviously I can't do that. Or, depending, some clinics and some places are open about if the donor reaches out, let's say, and she says, would you contact the recipients and see if they're interested in speaking with me? Some programs and clinics do that. Some do not do that. On the do not do that side, I can definitely see both sides. And sometimes I think donors feel really frustrated with clinics and egg banks and sperm banks, and they don't understand why we are being a thorn in their side, right? But again, it's also protecting not only the privacy of those intended parents, but also the fact that if this child isn't 18 years of age yet, that's one thing. The other thing, maybe they're not ready, the intended parents, or maybe they're just not ready to even connect with the donor yet. And there is that emotionalness for them of maybe rehashing or bringing up things that they didn't know were going to be a possibility in the future. And then you kind of have to deal with their feelings and emotions on that as well. And then the flip side goes back, well, then how do you go back to the donor and say, actually, they said they didn't want to talk to you?
All these scenarios to think about from the beginning, and especially having worked here, 15 years now, like I've had the situation of someone donate and then have to come back in the future as a patient and maybe not be successful and not be able, and that's a tough situation. I've had someone recently say, is there any way to see if there's still any of my eggs? And I'm like, no, we weren't doing that back then. So all these things that you don't always consider when you're 24, but yeah.
Right?
And how hard to know that your eggs are out there, but you can't use them. It's just things that we didn't consider now we're kind of running into. I think our donors get to know if they had pregnancies results, right?
Our clinic will let a donor know whether or not a pregnancy and a live birth was achieved. We won't tell them the sex. We don't say where the intended parent lives or anything like that, of course. But what I find curious about that is I do a lot of the donor updates. And so that's when a donor comes back to us, maybe they donated and they want to donate again. And probably our listeners might not realize that they don't have to go through all the initial screening, but we have to repeat all the blood work, the physical, and we actually have them repeat the psychological evaluation portion, and they meet with us. Part of that's like, how was your experience? How did things go for you? One of the questions I ask them is, have you found out the result of your donation? A lot of times they'll say, no, but I'd like to know that. And even though they know they can find that out, I will reinforce to them again, well, here's the person that you need to call. She's the one that can tell you that. Feel free to reach out anytime. But again, it's funny, a lot of times they don't. Maybe it's just timing. I mean, they have the desire, they have the interest, or sometimes I'll have donors tell me, well, I never officially asked, but I know they asked me to be a donor again for a genetic sibling. So I'm assuming someone got pregnant.
Well, I think people may not realize how tough it is to be accepted as a donor in the first place. Like, you're not automatically able to donate again either. To approve
Correct.
a donor to cycle again, we are looking at outcome data as well as how the cycle went. So yeah, in an ideal scenario, if someone's a good fit to be a donor, it is nice to have them do it more than once because they've gone through a lot of hard work to get screened. But having been accepted once also isn't a guarantee that you would even be accepted to donate again. But they really do like to make sure that there's a good outcome before we continue to cycle.
Good point. Yes.
I know we're getting kind of to the end. Anything else you think we should make sure to cover? And obviously, this is just scratching the surface over the issues that can be involved in egg sperm donation.
Yeah, and we're covering a lot of people too, right? We're covering like the donors and the offspring and the intended parents. It's a lot of people.
I think we have to, though, right? Don't you?
Mm-hmm.
It's a family building model. It's not just looking at one piece of the model or one piece of the puzzle. The one thing I don't know if I touched enough on or said was there is an issue of lack of donors, egg and sperm, in certain populations, which can be really frustrating. So, for instance, it's often hard to find an Asian donor, East Indian, a Black donor. And for those patients, especially in egg donation, it's yet another hurdle. It's another frustrating part of their journey. And it always makes me feel so bad when I have to sort of educate and say, you know, it might take a little longer or the supply's pretty limited. But honestly, that is the reality as well.
And that is another area where being able to have frozen eggs has made at least a big difference because there's geographic variation in terms of where you have a lot of young women of different ethnicities. And so I do feel like it's a little better now than it used to be, although yes, definitely still there are many underrepresented populations. And these are often people that are already marginalized in terms of getting fertility treatment. So you're right, it's like one more little really knife in the back kind of twisting.
I know, and I always try and be just so sensitive to that. And culturally, the other piece I forgot to say is my bias and the bias in the field is pro-disclosure to children of their genetic origins for all the reasons we've already discussed, right? However, culturally, there are some cultures that do not do that, and those patients will not do that. And even though my bias is, well, you really should do that, I am respectful and have to be that. In some cultures, that would bring a lot of shame to the family, or people would not accept that child. So I always am like, okay, keep that in mind for myself.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We could talk about this stuff first. There's so many little, I mean, as you can tell, there's so many things to discuss and little areas that you don't think about. Like every time you mention something, I'm like, oh yeah, I've never considered it that way. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the embryo donation side of things in our short snack later this week. So definitely check that out. Melanie, it was so lovely to have you on. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate being able to be here.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.